Is that a German word in your pocket, or are you just happy to see me?
Cube roots, cube roots, cube roots. Welcome to Cube Roots, the old school German style board games podcast. I'm your host Nicholas Weiss. I have a fresh haircut and now I look like an oversized baby. Joining me today are the founder of the OG Guild and board game excavator, Daryl Boone.
Hello. I am told I look like Bruce Willis if he was a giant baby.
Also joining me today, the secret fairy godmother of the guild, our favorite lurker, Samo Oleami.
Hello, nice to be here. I think my presence will either A, dissolve the weird perceptions BGG has about me, or make it stronger.
Beep 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 beep. Hello everyone, Future Nicholas here. What you just heard was good sound quality Samo, which will not be the case for the remainder of the episode. I'll spare you the boring technical details, but essentially what happened is a massive misunderstanding plus a giant screw-up that are both entirely my fault. I had two files, assumed they had separate sound content, and edited the one that has the worst sound quality. I realized my mistake while this episode was already rendered and uploading, so I cancelled the upload, went back to my workbench and realized that the current episode was over 1600 different clips, and that I was not ready to redo the entire edit with a new sound file. I apologize to you for the inconvenience, and to Samo for screwing up his sound quality. Thank you for your understanding. Future Nicholas out. Beep 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 beep. Before jumping into the topic of the day, we would like to dedicate this episode to Klaus Teuber, whom we heard the passing of in the last hours. Klaus Teuber was mostly known for being the designer of Die Siedler von Catan, Settlers of Catan, without which I think the landscape of the OG games and maybe the hobby as a whole would be very different nowadays, or maybe would have taken on later. It's hard to overstate how important that game has been for the spread of modern board gaming on the international scene.
Yeah, I mean, he's won the Spiel des Jahres, I think, more often than any other designer. I know he's won it 4 times.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he for Barbarossa, and Drunter and Druber, and Adel Verpflichtet, otherwise known as Hoity Toity, and, of course, Catan. And he has some other notable games, of course, like Löwenherz and Entdecker. Just really well-respected designer, of course. The story I had heard was when Mayfair got the rights to it, to Catan, they gave it to their testers, and the testers, locked themselves away in a room for hours. And when they came back, because they had to come up with something. So they said, add 1 night card or something. Just to have something to change, because it was already basically perfect. And there was a role-playing magazine called Arcane that didn't really cover board games, but they covered Catan and gave it a 10 out of 10, which kind of blew people's minds at the time.
So for me, coming into the hobby, when I say coming into the hobby, I mean coming to BGG, because I was playing games continuously since childhood. For me, Catan was always like the limit of what I call interaction. I want as much as in Catan or more. I'm not taking less. Even with Power Grid, sorry, just a little too little. And another nice thing about Catan is how thematic it is, how it, in Euro terms, so in simplistic, elegant, emergent way, it creates a narrative. And also, like the most common way I play it, it's not actually Catan, but it's Rivals for Catan, so the 2-player spin-off, let's say, which is like, again, engine building, there's no trading, but has really a nice narrative, and my partner enjoys it a lot. So.
Yeah, and to bounce off of the idea that Catan is very thematic, if I remember correctly, initially Klaus Teuber wanted to making about the discovery of Virgin Islands from Vikings. And it's actually the publisher who toned down the setting of the game in a way that now is misinterpreted as Renaissance-type colonialism, and which is why people suppose the word Siedler or settler got off the name, where initially it was not about colonizing inhabited spaces at all. We actually had thematic OGs that had tasteful themes. The other way the game is very notable is that, if I remember correctly, the publisher was a bit concerned that the game would be too complicated for a family-weight game. And that's why I think it's super important that this game pierced so much, because it opened the floodgates for other types of involved games to actually crystallize the hobby around them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, because like I own a board game restaurant, right? And we kind of put stickers on our games to indicate, how complex they are. Something like a Ticket to Ride or something, we have that as a green sticker, which is kind of like a light strategy. But Catan, even though it has this reputation as a gateway game, we actually have it as one step up. And that's reflected in the age range. I think most of the boxes say 10 and up. Obviously, there is the negotiation, which kids don't necessarily do well in that part, but it also helps make it a self-balancing game. All right. I mean, parents aren't going to take advantage of their kids when they're playing Catan, right? Make a terrible deal. In some ways, Catan, certainly was the perfect representative of German games coming over to, I would say, North America. Like I'm speaking as a Canadian, but what a perfect representative of those German games coming over here, and what an introduction that we had to them.
But also, I think that a game that never was replicated. I mean, what Catan does, there really is no substitute in terms of being social. You could say on the level of party games, social, where people really matter, and being also strategic. Like this blend of both just isn't there.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I said something similar to this in last episode, which is, okay, people today say they are tired of Catan, Catan is so passé and whatnot, and I'm just asking them, okay, but what is the game that does Catan better than?
I'm actually surprised, because when I read on Board Game Geek the news item for his passing, of course, people can't help but mention, it's like, oh, I'm really sorry to hear that he died. I didn't much like Catan. But I, respect his position in the gaming history or whatever, and that kind of bugs me a little bit that people feel the need, even at this moment, to kind of downplay Catan. You're absolutely right. Nothing has replaced Catan. I would argue Catan has replaced Monopoly, right? It still has the feelings of obviously the trading aspect, but also the building up and also the luck of the dice rolls that can add excitement. So it really replaced Monopoly, and nothing has replaced Catan.
Well, I think you have like this sort of levels of going into the hobby. Like the acolyte level is I hate Monopoly, and then to become like higher level initiate, you need to hate Catan, and then for higher level you go like, yeah, really, I never liked Tigris and Euphrates. Really.
Tigris and Euphrates is an okay children's game, but I like I like a more challenging game. It's the popular thing to just crap on Catan nowadays, and makes me sad.
I don't know how to tastefully transition into a more cheerful podcast from them. I just think we owe a lot to Klaus Teuber as a guild and as a hobby, and rest in peace.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, speaking of our cube roots, let's jump into the topic of the day.
It's a topic of the day!
The topic of the day is why OGs? So, as we said in episode 0, a lot of people in the OG Guild are fond of variety of game genres, and we really don't want to yuck anyone's yum. But the desire to enchant OG games as a genre comes, let's be frank, in reaction to the direction of the kind of game design trends that have become more and more popular over time, which I do believe neither of us three around this virtual table is the biggest fan of. So my question to you would be, how did you start to see the hobby change around you? And how did it go away from your tastes? Or in the case of Samo, even further away from your tastes, to something else. I do not have that much experience in the matter, because when I formally, if there's such a thing as formally joined the hobby was already in a transition state, such that I always find Eurogames a bit boring until I rediscovered them on the late. Maybe one of you, say Daryl, could tell me how it was back then and how it changed.
Sure. I mean, I got into the hobby in 2004, and even at that point, it was a little bit transitional. I mean, from my memory, the number one game on Board Game Geek was Puerto Rico. But there was still a huge amount of respect for games like Medici and obviously Tigris and Euphrates and all those. Those were all like top 10 games, if I remember correctly. And yeah, obviously with a hobby like board games, in which there are so many releases that come out every year, and everything that comes out is built on multiple things that came out before, the transition becomes very gradual. And so sometimes we don't even notice. And there is an assumption that newer is better, right? That's in a lot of hobbies and a lot of industries, just the newer thing must be better than the older thing because it's newer, right? There were a couple of weird kind of realizations that I had just when interacting with people on Board Game Geek. From a historical point of view, we would call them German games or German style games, but eventually we started calling them Euro games because there were games, coming from other countries than Germany. Germany's still very much the epicenter. But what I hadn't noticed for a long time was actually the meaning of Euro was changing over time.
Right.
And you would have, one example for me was I would see recommendation threads. People say, what's a great introductory Euro to enter into, discover Euros? And people will be throwing out things like Castles of Burgundy, which I don't think is an intro to anything. Like it's not the most complicated board game out there, but it's involved, right? In my head, introductory Euros, I'm thinking Ticket to Ride, stuff like that. And then I heard somebody call Il Vecchio, which is a Euro. It's fine. I haven't played it, but it doesn't seem particularly memorable. I apologize to all the Il Vecchio fans who are listening to this. I saw somebody describe it as Ticket to Ride the Euro, which blew my mind because Ticket to Ride is already a Euro by all definitions that I knew of. Then I realized that it's the definition that's changed. Now when people casually use Euro, it's to mean a more complex variety. So that's part of the transition. But yeah, the other part of the transition would be the movement from very interactive games from the 90s, like the auction games and head-to-head kind of tile laying games like a Tigris and Euphrates, or area majority like El Grande, and then moving on gradually introducing more things that people can do without having to interact with other people. And that, I suppose you could say, starting with Princess of Florence. Fans of Princess of Florence would certainly say there's an important auction. I'm not going to disagree with that, but that was the first game we start to see that players have their own little board in which you're focusing a lot on that, like the positioning of your buildings on your board, which is completely independent of what other players are doing. That's considered more of like an evolution of the games that came before, and the evolution kept going and going and going in that direction until we reached the point where some of the most popular games have effectively no interaction, or at least accidental interaction, right? I take a thing, I draft it from the center of the table. You wanted that thing. I didn't know that. I'm barely paying attention to what you're doing. Because you're way over there doing your own thing. I'm worrying about my own little board in front of me.
Yeah, I'll just interject, when you say Il Vecchio is a very special Euro in terms of having two sides. You have two boards. One is brown and the other is browner, And if we go into Castles of Burgundy, it's also an introduction to brown Euro games, right? And which then clicks, with multiplayer solitaire trope in terms of it's intellectual, it's thinking. Yeah, so I came to Board Game Geek in 2009, and at the time there was really no local scene. No shops, no nothing. So basically all the Euros I bought then, because I didn't know what I was doing, it took a couple of years to sell them. And so initially, my first two buys were Pandemic and Arkham Horror. And this was at the time of a bit like in the second stage or third stage of Ameritrash Eurogame wars on Board Game Geek, me mostly siding with Ameritrash.
Yeah.
So my first shock was, I was buying games and going like, okay, what should I, worker placements are, hot. So there were 5 of them at the time. Like Agricola, Le Havre, Kingsburg, Stone Age, and Pillars. And so I asked, what should I buy? And they went like Le Havre. And somebody says, yeah, but it's complicated. And I was like, hey, I was a dungeon master for Dungeons and Dragons 3.5. I've just figured out Arkham Horror. I think I can do complex roles. And then we opened Le Havre and tried to play it. And after an hour, we made a break. We look at each other and said just who the hell finds this fun? Yeah, for us, it's work. And still I was initially playing board games with friends. And really, it was for casual gamers that the game needs to be interactive. Citadels worked fine, Power Grid didn't. this sort of progressed. I bought a game, maybe it worked, maybe it didn't, because I was still trying to figure out my own taste. And everything changed in 2012 when I joined the local Eurogaming club. So it was the only local scene, and they were Eurogamers. And at the end of that year, so 8-9 months in, I did the non-alignment manifesto against complexity in games, and I did my first worst games I played this year list. Actually, meeting people who like Eurogames just made it worse. In some sense, it was just like, I'd like to know you people, and it took like a couple of months for social connections to form, which, they did, we're friends. But like when I do like kids workshop or like with casual gamers, we can get to what I managed to do with Eurogamers in 6 months. I can do it like in 15 minutes.
Yeah, I mostly come from an angle that is fairly similar to Samu. I didn't realize that I wasn't that late into the hobby because I started playing modern games, aside from Magic the Gathering, in like 2005 and lurked on BGG at the time. And I always felt like what we now see at the transition, I felt like Euros were boring. So of course I would enter from, at best, the kind of overproduced hyper-thematic stuff, so stuff that was made by either Days of Wonders or Fantasy Flight Games. Then I went into more and more complicated games until I realized that I liked the sales speech of the game more than the reality of playing them, because the rules always got in the way. And I thought that because indie designers were beginning to be the future in the field of video games, that I should follow indie designers in the field of board gaming. And I just started kickstarting their stuff, which was not well playtested half the time. And I would end up reselling the things. And I was like, okay, where are the games that are made to be interactive, but don't have all that massive bunch of fiddles so that I can actually play with other human beings? And I was not aware at the time that there was a time when. I knew a couple titles, I was searching things around, and I essentially... I don't know that I formalized the idea that OGs existed until I found essentially Darrow's channel at the eve of the pandemic. Now, the OG Guild has been merely the conclusion of existing attempts to, if not precisely delineate old school German style games, at least raise awareness of considerations that something was amiss in the hobby. And I'm happy to have you two here because I'm not only thinking of the sort of old games don't stop being good mantra of Darryl's YouTube channel, or back in 2012, Samu's non-aligned manifesto that he just talked about earlier, and that I discovered I was actually in that thread, so I already had good taste at the time, apparently. How did your thinking lead you there, and how did it influence your gaming? Maybe starting with Samu, who had dibs on the concept of complaining about complications and non-interaction in games.
My non-aligned manifesto wasn't really about old German games. It was just simply all this stuff which is on the table. I just want to throw it off the table and engage with people. Of course, in terms of Euro games, that's one thing, but I was also against the more complicated Ameritrash games, mostly being fan of light Ameritrash games, like something like, I don't know, King of Tokyo, which came a bit later, or, Wiz War, or Tales of Arabian Nights, Survive. So my idea was, if a similar effect could be achieved with a lighter game, with lighter rules, I want the light one. There are some exceptions. So for instance, if you check my top 10, I have Android, so Kevin Wilson's game in there, which is, I think you need 2 brains for it. One for rules upkeep and one for the narrative. And also I have like Arkham Horror in my, top 15. And for me, the logic is these games do with complexity something that cannot be done otherwise. So they create a narrative, immersion, a story, and that is for me legit. But if you want something else, if complexity is there just for complexity's sake, just for puzzling, I'm not interested in that, and I want the simpler version of that game. Funnily enough, I posted that manifesto on Fortress Ameritrash at the time because Martin said, hey, let's try. and got serious backlash because it was like they were still at the time bitter about being thrown out of BGG. Yeah, and they felt like I was promoting a new genre or something, and how dare I, or something of that sort. So I guess that the whole post fermented over time, and I don't know what is its position now. This maybe Nicholas is better for you to explain, but for me it was just simply I want engagement with people on various levels with as little interference as possible.
Yeah, but my understanding of it is that complexity is fine insofar as it helps creating a narrative that you share with other people rather than a puzzle that you share in your own little corner of a table. And that otherwise, if you don't have that sort of thematic enhancement, you'd rather not have to deal with all the fiddle.
Well, there's just one thing I wanted to mention previously. When I came to Board Game Geek, there was still this fame of progress. You know, what Daryl mentioned, new thing is better. There was actually, I mean, it's still this myth of board games progressing into places better, and this fetish for new mechanisms. At the time, this was Dominion and deck building. And so everybody was then waiting, what was the next thing, Then actually Ameritrash made a sort of comeback with reprints of games from 1980s, 1970s, 1990s, from Fantasy Flight games, and then we were all waiting what would be the next Euro thing. And we surprisingly figured out Yasa games, so just another soulless Euro. So it was just generic Euro, didn't do anything new. It was brown, it was tedious, things like Il Vecchio. And there was a market for that. And that was that, okay, so MPS Euros are here to stay. And so when Kickstarter happened and just added theme to the mix, or like layer of colors, let's call it. So basically, every few years, I try a new Euro or a hot Euro to just see how deep we had fallen into this multiplayer solitaire. Bottomless well? I don't know.
And so, essentially, same question to Daryl, albeit a bit later. I understand that between 2012 and 2020, we had an amount of people who have been banging around, as Martin would say, on the topic of more elegant game, or what we call JASE, what you just said, just another soulless Euro. And then you, Daryl, how did you come to want to make the channel and spread that message? And was there some trigger, and had your gaming habits already changed, or were they about to change?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Martin and a number of others have been talking about this for a long time, talking about the old school Euros or the classic Euros. And I've always agreed with that, although I've never been a particularly vocal part of BGG.
Which is a shame.
Yeah,
that would have been nice. In hindsight, given what you have to say, it would have saved me years, probably.
Yeah, my favorite comment to my YouTube channel is somebody who said that I'm so opinionated I shouldn't have a YouTube channel. Because in order to have a YouTube channel, you should have nothing to say. That should be a prerequisite.
That sounds like most YouTube, to be honest.
Well, that's where I was going with it. So I'm going to admit I'm a bit of a hypocrite. I don't actually watch YouTube videos about board games.
If you want to produce any, you don't have the time to.
Yeah. But even before I started the channel. But there was an awareness on my side, and I assume a lot of people's side, that a lot of these YouTube channels, of course, they're always chasing the new thing. It's feeding the consumerism. It's feeding what we call the cult of the new. And it's not like they're trying necessarily to be consumerist, but there are encouragements in the way this whole hobby / industry is set up that just leads to that, of course, right? So now you have the thing where you have, YouTubers who are getting brand new copies of games, that are not even out yet, so they can put out a video on it, and the video is almost exclusively positive. I think even if they were to do a negative video, they probably just wouldn't post it. But what ends up happening, what the result is it just feeds into this consumerism, but it's always consumerism for the new thing. And if you combine that with the fact that, or the observation that games have changed over time, and some people may actually prefer the older style of game over a newer style of game, this kind of just feeds that and takes people further away from that older, what to some people was almost an ideal, but moving away toward the state we're in now.
And that's the kind of emergence of a more consumerist hobby that probably makes it a good idea for you to express on YouTube rather than BGG, because you would be met with more hostility. And I realized that with Samo over the latter part of the 2010, whose posts, even though they were never any form of ad hominem, somehow people had started making what they consume such a part of their identity that they felt like more and more attack from people who were disagreeing with them or making any form of comment about the way they were experiencing the hobby.
I mean, for sure, there was things I noticed in Geek Madness, which was sort of like annual, or still is annual, let's just say rant fest, where a game competes against another game. So when I jumped in, it was still Ameritrash versus Euro. And what happened then is Ameritrade just sort of collapsed. People went away, and I'm kind of stubborn and I don't want to change it. So I just continued with my same attitude, but was suddenly framed as this terrible villain. And actually, I mean, had I still been on BGG, I probably would have skipped Madness because it just gotten a bit nasty. And so let's unwrap this a bit. What Daryl was saying with consumerism, what this actually means is a transition from where, as a player, your main connection is the group. So you want to invest in the group, into the social connections. If you check games like, old school Ameritrash or old school German games are about family gaming or friends or people who have social connections. And if you play with people who have social connections, we all know we're just having fun. So if I'm attacking somebody, or these plastic pieces or wooden pieces are attacking those pieces, this isn't personal. We're just role-playing because we're investing into this share fun, into this share engagement. We're all co-creating, we're all sharing. Maybe it has narrative, maybe it has memorable experiences as it's usually framed. And so we then shift with multiplayer solitaires in a situation when many interaction is between a player and the game. And if you extend this, you get main interaction is between player, then game, then content provider, meaning designer, then publisher. So suddenly main connection of player becomes as a consumer of published material and not as much into the social, into the place of social connections. And this then feeds back into interactions on forums like Board Game Geek. So if you don't understand that something challenging an idea could be playful or could be a discussion or, like playing Risk or Small World or, whatever you want. And if you take this as, oh no, somebody took the action I wanted, and turn all red, and, then any non-positive feedback is seen basically as aggression.
I mean, you would hate it to go to Geek Madness these days, because, lately I read a post that said, many of us don't miss the Donald Trump of Geek Madness, which I'm pretty sure they were referring to you. That's the level of how attacked they feel right now, and how they want to frame your involvement in it, which used to be a pretty joyful bashing on any game is allowed a decade ago. Now is a harsh defense on games that are already... It's not enough for them, I'm stealing a line from Andy here, but it's not enough for them that their game is already incensed by the entire critic. It's not enough for them that their game is on the top 10 of the BGG charts. They want absolutely no dissenting voice, because otherwise, what does their life mean?
Well, but the fact that they're mentioning me a couple of years down the road just means that they're bored.
I, for one, miss your involvement.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure. It occurred to me I never actually answered your question about, where I went with it. I didn't really talk about the channel and that. So that was my observation on YouTube, and I didn't see anybody talking about those older games, that older style of games that I liked. So I thought, well, nobody else is doing this. Let me do it. I'll do it terribly, I'm sure. I've never done this sort of thing before in my life. But, with the pandemic, I had been talking about it for actually a couple of years, if you asked my friends. But, I'm busy or whatever, right? Pandemic comes, my restaurants are shut down, the whole society is locked down. I'm like, I don't have an excuse anymore now, do I? So, and I was so surprised when I started to get just this massive amount well, massive to me because I'm a little bit of a wallflower normally, but a lot of positive feedback just saying, yeah, I love these games. These games are great. Thank you so much for talking about them. And then, I mean, my channel is still small, but when one or two people suggested that I create a guild on Board Game Geek, I thought that's kind of limiting if I just make a guild about my channel. My channel is small potatoes, right? But why don't we just create a guild that's just for this style of game that we kind of miss? In this particular example, the old style German games, we kind of miss those. And when we talk about them, especially when we talk about them as old school Euros or classic Euros, the conversation just gets drowned out by everybody talking about the new stuff and dismissing the old stuff. So it was really great to be able to create a guild, and very lucky that, for example, Martin was able to let people know about it in his magical way. And so we had a lot of people joining in, just really appreciating the style of game, talking about the new games that come out of this style. And you know what? It is unfortunate that we have to define OGs or describe this type of genre as something in contrast to modern Euros, because then any positive thing you say about your favorite style of game will be perceived as a negative about the newer style of game, because it doesn't have that. So the newer games don't have interaction. You can't just say, oh yeah, I don't like those newer games because they don't have much interaction. That's when you get the pitchforks coming out, right? Well, clearly there's a subtle interaction, you know. You have to pay attention. It's like, yeah, but you don't really, do you? Like, you say you pay attention to what other people are doing, but that's only after you've played it maybe 20 times or something. If you're just sitting down with your friends and they have their own board and you have your own board, and the only interaction is you're just taking things from the middle, how much are you really paying close attention to what other people are doing? Maybe in a 2-player game, maybe, but I would bet otherwise not so much. It is unfortunate, though, that when we describe these older kind of games and what we like about them, it naturally kind of opposes the newer style. Anyway, it's just nice to have a place where you can talk about this stuff without being drowned out by people kind of defensive of their favorite newer style of game.
Okay, so I have a notepad open with the following text. Transition, how do we frame all this in terms of the history of the board gaming hobby? Don't forget to find an elegant segue into the role of the Spiel des Jahres before Tuesday, you dumb.
Wait, did I write that to you? Sounds like something I'd say. I think what we kind of see is that the cult of the new has always been a thing in the hobby. A lot of hobbyists are very curious, as to what new thing is coming out. It's understandable. That's really been energized over the last several years, and everything has been feeding this cult of the new. From Kickstarters that develop a sense of the fear of missing out if you're not backing, and getting that deluxe edition that won't be available on retail.
Yeah, and when you say the last years, it's more like the last decade.
Yep.
Yeah. Plus the YouTube, which is often fed by the Kickstarters, because the Kickstarter campaigns will get a bunch of YouTubers on to talk about how great their new game is, even though they only probably just got it in the mail 2 days ago and have to put out content for the campaign ASAP. Certainly they're not playing the game, 10, 15 times before giving a balanced review, right? The whole system just encourages positivity, right? Positivity toward the new thing.
Right, but also, to be fair, I just want to push back a bit against the idea that you have to play a game 10 to 15 times before being allowed to have an opinion on it.
Absolutely not.
There is a different reality that whether your work is commissioned or not, as a professional YouTuber, you have to pour out content at such a rate that you cannot dedicate a single game the time that it, air quotes, deserves before reviewing it, because to be able to maintain your workflow and make a living out of it, you have to play a game, review, play a game, review, play a game, review, and play a game probably a single-digit amount of time, maybe a low single-digit amount of times. That's unfortunately how the profession has crystallized.
Right. I don't disagree with that at all. I 100% agree with you. And I guess I'm talking about the incentives. I don't blame any YouTubers for doing it that way, especially the ones who are trying to make money, trying to make a living off of this. This is the way the industry incentivizes them to act. So again, sometimes it's tricky to kind of tiptoe around the negativity aspect of it, right? Because I don't want to seem negative to other YouTubers. My YouTube channel is not that great by most people's standards, I would assume. So, glass houses and all that. I'm just saying that these incentives just build on top of each other. And so now we have this sort of hyper energized call to the new, where even if somebody was super excited about a game that came out 2 years ago, and now they got it in their hands, and they play it once or twice, and they convince themselves that it's great, and they're already looking toward the next thing.
Yeah, I'd go in even further. Seems to me that the whole Kickstarter model encouraged a particular, let's say, architecture of the game, a particular blueprint which is ideal for Kickstarter, and this is this frame of multiplayer solitaire, or let's say indirect interaction Euros, which are basically puzzles in terms of you have this huge menu of options the designer laid out before you, and you pick an action, so action selection, either it's drafting, either it's worker placement, either it's deck building, or nothing above but plays the same way. And what this all means is that all these games have the same way of engagement with the audience. So you can play any of them. That's why you can jump right in and immediately get what the game can offer. And the second is everything is literal, everything is obvious. There's no real emergence, there's no in-between lines. Because when we talk about like these old German games, I mean, if you pick a game like Imperial, you need 10 games to even scratch the surface, because what's going on is that you need to behave in each game in a different way. You have to actually change your behavior. I lie differently in Kakerlaken Polka than in, let's say, Resistance. There are different patterns, and you need a couple of plays to actually learn. And this takes willingness, takes patience, takes a group which is willing, right? And if you just want to stuff your, mouth with candy and just go, then you get like this sort of games that are made to deliver everything in the first try. And after 10 tries, you can, sell them and buy a new one.
So that's interesting. It's almost like a sugar rush. When you're playing that game for the first time. But then that sugar rush dies down, you're looking for a new sugar rush, and you're not going to get it from the same game necessarily.
But you're looking for a game that can provide sugar rushness, right? So you get the same type of design, right?
I will slightly push back against it, so I push back against everyone a bit, in that it's the case for an amount of this game, but I would say the genre doesn't have to be like that, in that having a modern Euro game is not antithetical with having enough depth that you can play it a lot of time, and we have an amount of people in the guild that have like triple digits amount of games of Agricola or something that makes me want to blow my brains out, because they find it interesting and intricate. The difference between them and me is that, and that's not a criticism, that's a different approach to gaming, is that they like the engineering part of games, where you have a game that is a mechanical puzzle that they like to untangle, like people who like to optimize SimCity video game or whatnot, but that is not the space that I want to inhabit if I play a board game, because to me, board games are some of the fiddliest types of games that exist, and if I wanted to play a complicated simulation, I would involve an outright computer to take care of the fiddle for me.
Yeah, and I'm not... I can totally understand if somebody wants to dig deep into a solo game. I'm not much of a solo gamer myself. But if you love that puzzly aspect of figuring out the game, you set up that game in front of you, spend a couple of hours at it to your heart's content. It's not for me, but there's plenty of room in the hobby for lots of different types of games. But when I'm sitting at a table with my friends, with my family, I don't want to have to fight those rules just to interact with my family. That sort of experience where we're always, checking the rules to make sure we're playing it right or whatever. The ideal game to me is one where, people like complexity more and more as they get more kind of, advanced, more experienced with these types of games, and they crave complexity. But as Samo said, the complexity, and I believe you said, Nicholas, the complexity should be in service of something. And otherwise, to have complexity for complexity's sake, don't put that in there in a multiplayer game where you're just trying to have fun with other people. So my preference is the games where they just kind of, the rules just kind of melt away. Once you, maybe after one game, you got it. There's nothing anymore that's in the way of having fun with your friends.
So one of Geek Madness jokes I did was that Seven Wonders, its biggest interaction is when people pass the rulebook around to learn the icons.
I used to define multiplayer solitaire to people who didn't understand the concept by saying it's like the two-player mode of the original Super Mario Bros., in which when you lose a life, it's the turn of the next player to do, and they play on the screen alone and you watch them do. But actually I was wrong, because what happens in modern Euro games is while the other player is doing their stuff, you are thinking about your next turn and not watching one bit what they're doing. And I agree with Daryl 100% that it's not that I hate complexity per se, it's not that I want fiddle taken care of for fiddle to be care of, it's that I'm playing a multiplayer game, and multiplayer involves other players. I don't just want to have some sort of knitting contest where we're each crocheting our own thing from a common pool of yarn. But I know that some people, when hearing this, will be very excited and will ask me when I'm releasing that crocheting game, please.
Sounds like a great theme. You're onto something there, Nicholas. So we're talking about like the interactivity, you know, or a shared experience, right? Because something like Take It Easy is literally multiplayer solitaire, but it still feels like a shared experience because you're revealing a tile and everybody sees a tile at the same time. They're all reacting at the same time. And that still feels more interactive than something like a Cascadia, where we're just taking turns. And the analogy in my head, and I haven't thought this through fully, I'm wondering at what point something stops becoming a shared experience. So let's say we're all sitting down and we're watching a movie on TV together. It's a comedy movie. I think you'd agree that's a shared experience. We're all watching the movie at the same time and we're all laughing at the same parts, right? You would not agree that that's a shared experience.
Not for me. Not
Sam.
for me.
Okay.
But continue.
But you know where I'm going with that. Like, people have like parties of watching, you know, they had parties like, oh, let's get together and watch Game of Thrones together or something. And then that's a shared experience for them, right? So I'm interested in changing just slight parts of that and figuring out to like a modern hobbyist at what point it stops becoming a shared experience. Because let's say we're all sitting at the same table and we all got our phones out and we're all watching the movie at the same time, but on our phones. You know, we're still laughing at the same times, right? And we're all facing each other. To a modern gamer, that's still, at least with the arguments that I see online, that's still a shared experience, right? We can still talk while the movie's happening, stuff like that. Now, what happens if we start watching the movie at slightly different times? So I start watching the movie on my phone, and then Nicholas starts watching the movie 5 minutes later, and Samuel starts watching 11 minutes after I started. We're all watching the same movie, but we're laughing at different times. We're reacting to different parts of the movie at different times. And that's what a lot of modern, well, we've started in the guild to call Taken Makes. That's what a lot of those feel like. That we're playing the game and we're technically all playing the same game. Take and Make would be something like a Calico, like a Cascadia. With Azul's a little bit better because you can easily see what other people are doing, and there's a kind of a negative, you know, part. Anyway, I won't get into Azul. Probably everybody listening to this is familiar with it. But a lot of times these Take and Makes feel like that to me. That we're all technically playing the same game, but it doesn't feel like we're sharing the same experience because your game and my game are just a little bit out of sync.
How would try to conciliate your opinion with Samu's this is not a shared experience, is to postulate that whether an experience is shared or not is a continuum.
Of course, yeah.
And that Samu's threshold for when an experience
Is
stops
right
being
at the very
shared
beginning.
is quite at the very beginning.
Yeah.
I'll drop a philosophical, basically, context. Hans-Georg Gadamer, who talks about understanding and talks about understanding being a dialogue, either with a person or with a text or with environment. He says conversation is successful where at the end we're both fulfilled with it. So we're full of this conversation. Conversation means not just to move the conversation, but also to be moved by conversation. So like moving in both directions. And this is for me like social engagement. It's like being in this collective situation when I am also moved. I'm not just moving things. Yeah, I mean, so for me, one of the things with Modern Euros or versus Modern Euros is that for me, puzzles are just never complex enough. They're for me like a bit trivial, too simple. I mean, I understand the effort needed to solve them, and I'm not willing to take that effort, but I'm pretty sure what it would involve. And for me, people are complex. Either psychological games of bluffing, you look somebody in the eye and you don't know what the hell is going on. Either they're smarter than you or they're on that level where you're just like, you don't know. Did they follow what you said? Nobody knows. Or in a collective setting with group dynamics. So things are emerging between us, they're just like sort of burping into the surface, creating this stream, and we're all swimming in. Now, as opposed to Daryl's, this watching of television together, for me, the genre which is interesting are speed games. So technically, like a speed game like Jungle Speed, Double, like speed reaction games, there isn't really any interaction, right? You're just grabbing the fastest whatever it is to grab. But what I've noticed through workshops with kids is because it's motoric, so it's physical, and it's in close proximity, it just opens up certain like channels of behavior. It becomes visceral, it becomes emotive, and we get this sort of like tension, like Nicholas, you will know what happens if a cat jumps like in front of your face and you didn't anticipate, right? So certain bodily functions open up.
Yeah, pure joy.
Right, and so we get this shared vibe which is emotional and visceral, although you wouldn't say that actions themselves are interactive, but you get this sort of collective flow of things, right?
I mean, you're playing with very polite teenagers, because my remembrance of Jungle Speed is a lot of bumping and a lot of physical contact that ends in...
Play by the rules.
Let's say a bit of turmoil.
Play by the rules. It's not who the last grabs the totem, it's who first grabs the totem. Because if you play the last, then you have like 3 people rolling on the floor, which if you're a teenager and you want to get laid, probably that's what you want to do, but not on my workshop.
No, you want to play Twister.
But yeah, I would say like a speed game is absolutely a shared experience. So I guess that's what we're all. That's one thing we all have in common is we're looking for shared experiences as opposed to game experiences that just disconnect us from the other players.
Yeah, and mostly what I understand Samo said is that he found the most complex machine there is, which is the human mind, accessed with the simplest interface that board games have, contrarily to him modern Euro games being less interesting machines than the human mind, accessed with horribly complicated interface.
That's a very good point.
So for me, with games, it's also a question of like, so my motivation is A, social, B, thematic, and winning is like nowhere on coordinates. And there are some games that manage to do all of this, right? So there are games when I can play for interaction, but somebody else plays for winning, and it all works, right? For interaction, it means not that I watch interaction as in modern Euros, like if you want to win, you have to be careful what the other player is doing. No. For me, interaction is I get immediate pushback from another person or reaction, or there's something immediately happen. You do this and the other person says, Samo, you're a dick. That is immediate response, right? And in some games you can get this and also there's winning somewhere, or maybe it's even prominent. But with modern Euros, this place just doesn't exist. I just cannot get anything but winning out of them, and I'm not interested in winning.
Yeah, I don't even know that they would agree that winning is necessarily so important to them. But
mental challenge.
Yeah, exactly. It's the mental challenge. It's figuring out that puzzle. And you know what? I love puzzles. That's what I do instead of solo gaming. Is I'll just do a puzzle and just over in like 20 minutes or something. And that was good for me. I didn't have to set anything up on a table. Nothing wrong with wanting a mental challenge at all, but you're absolutely right that a lot of the mental challenge can come from the other players, right? You're playing a game of Medici. It's an auction game, and there's something that you value a certain amount, but you know that the next player really wants that thing. And so you're trying to thread that needle of, do I want to bid, how low can I go so that if I take it, I don't feel so bad? But it's high enough that they're second guessing whether they should have it or not. And then they end up buying it, and then they spend too much money on it. It kind of, puts them on their heels a bit. That complexity is allowed by the game rules. But it is the complexity that comes from the player interactions and seeing everybody, being able to see everybody's state, and just the interaction between them.
Yeah, I think what matters here is also the capacity of players to read other players and to read the group. And this is where it gets tricky, because this takes a couple of plays. If you just meet new people, you might need a couple of sessions to get there, or maybe you just, you don't have these skills. But modern Euros just take all this level away and everything is literal and defined. And that's why, they can deliver everything on the first try. But then we get to the other problem, is that if players are only used to playing modern Euros, then they never learn the skills required to play other games, like reading the people, figuring what the value of an auction item is, for instance, in this game or in that game. And so they don't even know how to engage with this, and that's why OGs are sort of niche, sort of in the hobby right now, I think.
But are they? And that's where I transition to the fourth part. Because we have to remember that Board Game Geek is not representative of the board gaming hobby at large, and even people. The entire pool of people who treat board gaming as their hobby are not representative of people playing games at large. And in the end, I don't think we've talked about the role of the Spiel des Jahres in the cementing of OG sensibilities, but the idea is that OG games have always been played by families, and as far as I know, we're in current year and families still exist. And Carcassonne and Catan still sell bazookas compared to anything else that comes out today. Because in the end, we still have sort of a bright future, maybe not necessarily within our micro bubble of old farts shouting at clouds, but within a general world who might be friendlier to these types of games than to your terraforming Marses and whatnot.
So I was just in France, really somewhere close to Nicholas in September, and there was a toy store. The ground floor were toys, but the upper floor was just board games. And like maybe, 20 titles, like one shelf was like family level stuff, like Ticket to Rides or that kind of stuff. Everything else was simpler. And I think with the hobby and the thing we kind of forget, I think there are like sort of two major markets. One is the hobby market, which is fueled by everything we spoke about. Yeah, games in Board Game Geek Top 100, they do sell a lot. And they do sell a lot by being promoted on YouTube, on Board Game Geek, and so forth. There for sure is this hobby market. But there's also the other board game market, which is basically, they're searching for a different kind of customer. So Board Game Hobby is basically about few people buying a lot of games each. While family market is a lot of people buy few games. So if people were just gonna buy like 3 titles per year or one per 3 years, then the whole concept of design is different. So then games need to last, they need to be replayable, they need to be accessible, they need to, engage different levels of grandma and father and grandchild, for instance, right? And here is where we get to like Spiel des Jahres.
Yeah, Spiel des Jahres, definitely, I've heard it described that way, as if reporters, I guess they were, that the jury is made of, if they were to recommend one game that year that grandma could just go out and buy and give to their kid and the grandkids to play together or something, without knowing anything about it, just knowing it's got that red pawn on the front, that's a safe bet. And actually, because that in the late 90s, there was this period of time where the Spiel des Jahres kind of veered a little bit more complex. You have games like El Grande and Tikal, Torres, and I think it was after Torres that they just immediately switched gears back to lighter stuff. That was, I think, the hobby market growing, because before that, most games in this sort of style were family games. And hobbyists would play them. Sometimes they would make their own variations, like they'll add like an auction for turn order or something, just to make them a little bit more gamery. And in the late 90s, you started to see more games that were aiming to cater to that market, but still be accessible for family gamers. So somebody could, like a family could buy El Grande and sit down and play it. and it would be a bit involved, but there's nothing about El Grande that they couldn't play. Like, it's not crazy complicated, but it has basically is able to do double duty almost. And I think there was a real sweet spot from my point of view in that period of time in the late 90s. And then after that, we started to see Spiel des Jahres kind of go, let's aim toward the family market. Like, this is what people rely on us for this. But then we started to see more games that were aiming exclusively for the hobbyists, as opposed to being games that tried to kind of cater to both. So you'd have more games like later Leia games, getting into like Princes of Florence and Puerto Rico. And then you start to see kind of that market kind of diverge a bit. And you're absolutely right. Like now it's very well diverged. Like when Catan came over here, it was in the context of hobby games.
From what I understand, Torres was one of the worst sellers from Spiel des Jahres because it was too similar to Tikal and too complex. And so this was one diversion then into simpler games, like, or how BGG calls it, Puerto Rico was robbed because Villa Paletti won that year. But then there was Dominion. Dominion was too complex. And then the jury figured out that they need to save Spiel des Jahres from themselves, and they invented Kennerspiel des Jahres. Kinderspiel has its separate jury, but the other jury does both Spiel des Jahres and Kennerspiel. So, the gaming one is the Kennerspiel, which is still for everyone, so not for hobbyists. But then you have like the Spiel des Jahres, which is aimed at everybody. As some know, for, 6, 7 or so years, so I've been doing board gaming workshops for kids from age of usually 7, 8. We want them to be in school for a year, so they learn the concept of listening to teacher and repeating instructions. But then till the age of, usually 14, but mostly it was like 10 to 12 years of age. And for that, I was mostly relying on German and French game markets. So especially the kind of things that, I've seen when I was in France. So a lot of speed reaction games, stacking games, flicking games.
Yeah, these are pretty big here.
Yeah, push your luck games. So for kids, our idea was also a bit particular. So we said, like, look, in school, they already learn certain skills, which are certainly corresponding to what modern Euros do. So, learn the rules, repeat the rules, solve puzzles the teachers give you. And so we said, okay, let's go into the other direction and give them experiences they don't get in school. For this, we relied on German and French market, which are pretty much alive and kicking. And so these OG games, they still are around, or maybe they're even a bit simpler in terms of being more directly marketed at family market.
Yeah, there are some great lighter games that work well for kids or a mix of kids and parents. And they just don't get talked about. One that I had a lot of success in the restaurant was a Banana Macho. This has nothing to do with Spiel des Jahres. I don't think it's been nominated or anything. But it's a great speed dice rolling game, and I can teach that to anybody. And I taught it even to a friend once, and they're like, how come I've never heard of this game? And it's like, because it's this light speed dice rolling game, nobody's going to be talking about this on Board Game Geek, right? If that's the only place you're getting your information from. But yeah, those lighter games, those are golden. Those are the ones I always teach at the restaurant. Games like Cockroach Poker, other speed reaction games like Wanted is a great one from Ravensburger. And I guess it's getting away a bit from the Spiel des Jahres stuff. But just lighter games in general, there will always be a place for those. And we should never forget how important that type of game is.
So is the conclusion that we should all make families in order to be able to play good games with them?
Yeah, 6-year-olds need to be able to play Terra Mystica, I think. No, this is really, we had one experience. So I ran like kids event. We had like tabletop event for general audience / hobbyist / whomever. And I had like 2 tables for kids. And there was a kid from a gaming parent, and that kid just didn't know how to engage with other kids of same age who were laughing their head off in one or the other speed reaction game, because that kid was able to play, I don't know which complex game at the age of 8 and learn that process. I felt a bit sad watching all this.
There is a kind of a joke that I see on Reddit and stuff. There's always the people that are bragging that their 7-year-old can play Terraforming Mars or something. And it's like, yeah, sure, they can. But is that the best way to interact with your kid? Is that way, right?
So there would still be a lot of things to say, and we have somehow slided away from the original topic, but we're running a bit short of time, so let's go to the next segment, which is...
The news!
Oh, wait, okay. We are doing the news still. Okay. Well, hopefully we'll just stick with some lighter news items this time, getting the really sad one out of the way. There is a new version of Rainer Knizia's classic game Members Only, which was originally in 1996. It had a version in 2010 from Mayfair called Glenn's Gallery, which apparently had some mistake on it. This one's going to be called Classic Art from Cool Minis or Not. So as kind of a partner to their modern art, they have classic art. It's coming out later this month, I guess, later in April, for retail about $40 US.
I've never heard of it. What is it about?
I don't know. I've never played it, but I guarantee you there are people in the guild who have. This is for you guys. Here's another game that maybe some other people haven't heard of is Formula E, which is an elephant racing game. I actually backed it on Kickstarter way, way too long ago.
Is it a sequel to Formula D?
No, it is not, but they did try to kind of make some acknowledgement. I think they did actually talk to Asmodee and ask, is it okay? Because you have Formula D now, can we make this Formula E? And they said it was okay. So it's a pretty OG racing game, originally from Brazil, with some input from Bruno Faiduti as a co-designer. I've played it. It's kind of a light racing game with some take that. Anyway, there's a new version coming out. It'll be called Elephant Rally. From a Brazilian publisher called Conclave, which I don't really know much about them. They seem to do a lot of localizations for the Brazilian market. Now, I don't play computer games, at least on Windows, but I'm aware of a German video game called Dorfromantik. This is pretty famous. So there is a German board game of that that's already had multiple printings, so it seems to be pretty popular. And an English edition is coming out, I think, any day now. I think from Cosmos. It is like the video game, I imagine. It will be like a solo game, but you can play it with multiple players.
I was like, is this an OG news? Because my partner likes Dorfromantik, the video game, quite a bit. So we jokingly nominated it as her favorite / only palatable multiplayer solitaire modern Eurogame of 2022. But of course, it had to be made into an analog form, just to take the piss.
You know what? Cut out the Dorfromantik bit. It's fine. Don't even worry about it. Next item.
But it turns out that Nicholas was an evil editor who took great pleasure in Darrell's suffering, so he left the bit in.
Designer Michael Schacht. He's had a few games in the OG Hall of Fame, including Web of Power, China Han, Iwari. He's a multi-talented individual, and he has developed a musical soundtrack with his own compositions that you can play alongside a game of Iwari. He's done this already with another of his games called Spirits of the Forest, also known as Web of Power, the card game, also known as Richelieu. Anyway, so he does this. He's a musician as well, and he's made a very atmospheric, kind of ambient soundtrack, kind of trancey, that you can play in the background while you're playing Iwari. That's on Spotify as a playlist. And finally, this is for all you Ark Nova fans out there in the OG Guild.
All three of them.
All three of them. This is for you, Andy. So now I've never played Ark Nova. My understanding, because the rulebook, I did scan the rulebook. It has 2 rulebooks, by the way. The PDF was so big, they had to split it up into 2 PDFs to get the whole rulebook in there. Anyway, it has these 2 tracks. Okay, so you're building a zoo, and one of the tracks is your classic victory point track that's going up. But you also have a conservation track, because you're trying to make an ethical zoo. And that's a track that moves backwards. And the game will end when they meet. And how much they overlap, that's your score. So if they overlap by a lot, you'll have a positive score. If they don't quite meet by the end of the game, then you get a negative score. Well, negative points, right? Make you feel bad. It's not good.
Oh, no.
Negative points. Who likes negative points?
Oh, no.
They make you feel bad. So, new change to the rules in all future printings. Just add 100 points. So, your average score, if you did have decent, will not be 0. It will be 100. And if you had a negative score, now instead of negative 14, it's 86. 86 doesn't sound that bad, right? You have 86 points. You like points, don't you?
Who made Stefan Feld the president of board games?
So if you all don't know, possibly my favorite post from Samo ever on Board Game Geek was on a geek
the
list
Castles
named
of Burgundy post, yes.
the Castle of Burgundy post from a geek list named Worst Game Ever. You have to read that. Even if you don't like what Samo writes usually, it's just goddamn funny.
It's an interview.
What a great introduction to Samo for anybody who's not familiar with him. Go read that post.
Absolutely. Go read that post. I'll link it in the description of the video or of the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this interview with Castle of Burgundy was, I feel for the guy. He just, the Castles of Burgundy, he just wants you to be happy and and only thing he can do, or they, I don't know, is to give out points.
Where does he get all the points? I don't know. He's got so many points to give away. He must have a little point maker back in his car, in the boot of his car.
Point inflation, then.
Yeah. Yeah, like pinball games. Everybody knows pinball, Play a pinball game from the 60s. You're lucky if you have a score of 100. And then by the time you reach Attack from Mars in 2000, the scores are, I only played for about 5 minutes. And your score is 1 billion points.
It is now time for everyone's favorite segment with my most cursed jingle.
The fan mail.
Did we take a poll? Is this really everybody's favorite?
Mark said the jingle can go burn in hell.
Okay.
Today we have 4 questions like last time. Long-time listener Bas wrote, in which type of games would you expect to perform better with a few pints in, and in which ones would you expect a complete car crash once oiled up? I mean, my first instinct is I would do horrible at dexterity games.
Actually, the only game of Power Grid I ever won was after 3 or 4 Bananatinis. So I figured something out that gave me a clarity of mind that day. I don't know what. I don't get drunk while playing games. I will have a couple of drinks maybe sometimes to, add as a bit of social lubricant. I usually don't find alcohol affects my ability to play games so much. Although I will often just, any game in which I could take it off the rails for laughs, I will. So after a few drinks, I'll maybe there's a proper way to play, but then after a few drinks, I'm not playing that way. I'm just having fun, doing whatever.
Yeah, and I'm functionally teetotal 360 days a year, in which I'm essentially, as the word says, full of tea. So I guess I can't contribute a lot to this question. If Samo, you have something you want to say about it?
Yeah, for me to reframe the question is, what does it mean to do well? For me, doing well means the group has fun. I don't care who wins, as I said. So if alcohol is involved, what would make still, a collective fun? Probably more of a social game or something, if people need lubricant, like to be creative or somewhat silly, I guess. Yeah, I cannot drink more than 1 glass per day, so not reacting too well, but, if the group is in the right mood, maybe.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, if I know alcohol is going to be a part of this shared group experience, then I'm probably going to want to stick with lighter games. Get those heavy euros off the table if I'm drinking. I want to have a laugh.
Oh my god, now I remember my first game of Catan. Like, I was a relatively new hobbyist, so of course I was like, there's Catan, there's this expansion. They made the expansion because it's a good idea, right? So my very first game of Catan was 6 players. And one of them was heavily inebriated, and it was a complete car crash. We barely finished it, and everyone hated the game, and it took me years to be able to propose a game of Catan again to my friends.
But it's interesting, right? Because people will blame the game for that. Maybe not on purpose. Maybe they know the situation. But still, the game, when they played the game, they felt a certain way, and they remember that feeling.
There is some responsibility to the state of awakeness and clear consciousness that we had at the time, but it was also the fault of the expansion. Nobody should play six-player Catan ever. Although I say that, I have a friend who's recently played 6-player Catan with all the expansion and treated it like an Ameritrash experience, and it was apparently the best on a custom map of Japan.
And see, at that point, it doesn't even have to be Catan, right? It could have been anything. They just lean into the situation, the ridiculousness of it, and just have fun with your friends.
Yeah, I have to mention a game which is or was a bestseller in Slovenia, so a local design, which is called Drinkopoly.
What?
It's a drinking game, And it has cards, and all cards are, so basically you roll a die, you pick some cards, and you do whatever it says on the card, and then people drink, or maybe you drink, or maybe other drink, but people drink. So a friend who runs a board game store said he's seen this at a con, and all the rules explainers were completely wasted.
I'm sorry, I had absolutely no stereotype related to Slovenia until 10 seconds ago.
It gets better. So the whole thing is like ways to really embarrass yourself in front of your friends, like performing sex acts dressed, or like simulating, stuff like that. And then you go, and to understand like Mittel Europa, you need to figure this out. Now, namely, I understand that there are people who have the need to get completely wasted and embarrass themselves. But which people need rules for that? Mittel Europa.
If you're still in contact with these people, they might want to take a look at a game called Kama Sutra by Bruno Faiduti. It's a game in which you are mimicking some acts with other consenting adults, but by having a balloon between the both people. And that's about it.
I love it. I think I would only play that game while drinking. I don't think you could convince me otherwise.
Long-time listener ChatGPT, knowing that there would be opinionated people, was maybe prompted to find a controversial question and wrote, "Do you think it's appropriate to include political or social commentary in board games, or should they strictly be for entertainment purposes only?" And I had the time to think about the question so I can chime in. And then you can, refuse to answer it to not open the wasp nest. So,
sure, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I have two angles to answer the question. The first time is games are an art form and they're able to do whatever they want. And that's as simple as that. If someone wants to have a political commentary, so be it. And if you're not happy about that, just don't buy the game. And if nobody buys the game, it will be pushed out the market. The second angle is, what does political mean? I have a bit of an extreme opinion on the matter, which is that actually most things that aren't political secretly are, which is that what are politics? It's not like people talking in an Oval Office about how to run the world. Whenever you have a group of people that agree about how we should live together, that's politics. And the moment that you display something like, I don't know, what the standard family unit looks like, you are making, despite yourself, political commentary. But what happens is that whenever something in a game goes contrary to your idea of the normal, then you start noticing it, and then you start treating it as political.
There's some good examples there. Like I remember there's a game, Legacy of Dragonholt, from Fantasy Flight, which is kind of almost like a choose your own adventure type game, and it's in the stealth LGBTQ genre, which I always enjoy when there's no necessarily knowledge going in as to what the content's going to be like, but then it reveals itself over the course of play. And you know what? It's telling a story. It's telling a different story than is the standard story, and I don't see anything wrong with that whatsoever. And as you said, people can just, if they have something against it, they can just not buy it. But that game is there for people who enjoy the game mechanisms and or the game content.
Yeah, and I'll jump in just to say that I know nothing about the game, right? But the idea that because a story is LGBT, it is political, that says something about... There was someone who made a joke that I like a lot, which is there are two genders, male and political. There are two sexualities, heterosexual and political, etc., etc.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. There's the cis sort of view of the world, and then there's political.
Yeah.
Don't make things political by talking about stories outside the norm or what they expect to be the norm. Kind of ridiculous.
And if you are part of the norm, you don't notice it. And that's not an indictment against people who are part of the norm, but a lot of people, for example, bought Istanbul and enjoy the game a lot. And then I know people who just had the reaction of, why is there a large double-digit amount of characters on all the styles and manual and whatnot that are 100% male? That's something that you can just not notice. And if someone else notices it, suddenly you may feel bad about it, but...
So I mostly agree with both points that Nicholas made. So as some know, I'm a theater critic which means various type of contemporary performing practices from dance to circus to whatever. So for me, the line between art and entertainment doesn't even exist. Everything works the same way. And of course, there's the freedom to tackle anything. It's of course tackled from artistic or entertainment point of view, which turns it into something else. It's not political, it's a game, or it's a play, or it's a book, or whatever it is. I think the issues you were talking about there are like games which are not theme-centric, and so theme is just sort of like a sticker, or basically it's just the visuals. And there, you can do anything. But I think that any issue which you tackle in depth, the way war games do, or, like political, like subgenre of war games, yeah, if you do it properly, if you do it thoroughly, I'll play anything.
Also, a part of the question is, or should they strictly be for entertainment purposes only? And now, another question that we don't have the time to answer today. Are games supposed to be fun?
Right. Absolutely not. Get out of here with your
not.
I like
Plague Drinkopoly.
You know me. I kick people out. I kick people out of the restaurant, or I threaten to kick people out of the restaurant who ask for fun board games. Jeez, where do they think they are? No, games are. I mean, like Oh man, where should I go with that? There's so many different directions to go.
Yeah, that could be an entire episode, I fear.
It could be. I'll try to make like one brief point. Yeah, I mean, wasn't the original version of Monopoly meant to be a political statement against sort of rampant capitalism when it comes to landowning, right?
Yeah, the landlord's game. There were actually two versions of the game, apparently, where midway you could choose between continuing the capitalism game or going through the communist one. And people realized that the socialist version of the game was not fun, which surprisingly is political commentary in itself, because
absolutely
the lesson is capitalism is more fun when you're the one in charge.
Or the context, like it's more dramatic, right?
Yeah.
There's going to be winners and losers in capitalism too, right?
Yeah.
And that's a political statement as well. So absolutely there's room for political commentary in games. And in my opinion, games don't have to be fun. I think that Train, the game just called Train, you guys both know about that, I'm sure, where you're trying to stuff pawns into basically cargo cars on a train. And no, you don't know this, or should I stop talking about it? Is that what you do?
What's that? I want to know about the stupid train game now. I thought you talked about Trains, the deck builder.
No,
and I was like, what?
Train, the game called Train. I wasn't sure if I should get into that.
Yeah, it's based. I mean, I'll spoil the spoilers, so just go there.
So the game is just trying to basically fit as many pawns into the train as possible, and maybe they're originally framed as families or whatever, but anyway, you got to fit them wherever you can, and you're trying to stuff them in, and it's only afterwards, after you finish the game, that you find out that this train is going to a World War II concentration camp, right? And then you're supposed to go back and kind of revisit your experience with it and how you were complicit in it. I think that's a fascinating experience, and I already know the ending, but if I didn't know the ending, I would love to have played that and experienced that. And yeah, games don't have to have a traditional sense of fun, and fun's going to be different things to different people anyway, so why even try to aim for it, you know? Yeah, as you said, game is an artistic medium. Make what you want. That's what problem I have with like playtesting. I would be a terrible playtester because, you know, people will make a game and a design, and then they'll ask me about it, and then the expected response is, you know, how can I make this game more fun? And I never have an answer to that, because like maybe this is exactly the game you want to make. Who am I to say you should change this and change that to make it more fun? But that's going to be stepping away from whatever vision you had of the game.
I mean, I also worked as dramaturge, or, you know, also in theater I will do like feedbacks, like common rehearsal if somebody invites me. You know, and then the question is always, what does this theater piece wants to be? You know, or what does like the game wants to be? Not what kind of fun it wants to become is like hopefully somewhere hidden in the material, not in the playtesters, but in, you know, whatever's there.
Long-time listener Andy wrote, which game do you think should have won the Ogie Award 2022?
Ooh.
So for Samo, we had a award Internet Tool Guild, where we picked games that had a large enough release in 2021 in the English market and just picked the one that we found was the best OG amongst them. And if you want an idea of the final, you don't have to chime in if you're not.
But is there some sort of list or somewhere?
Yeah, there's a link on the guild front page, I think. This was a tough one. Like, I would probably say that Scout is the best game of the three if we're just trying to say something objective, as if that's even a thing. It's not classically OG necessarily. The most classically OG would be Whale Riders, but it's, in my opinion, a little bit pedestrian for an OG. Like, it's fine, but it's like it wouldn't yell at me as being game of the year. I love Scout. I think Scout is a great game. I personally probably would have picked Brian Boru, and I think that's how I voted. Just as a great example of what we can expect as an OG style game in 2022. I think Brian Boru kind of, it has a shared board. There is a little bit of the almost like a trick-taking aspect to it, so there's a little bit of interactivity that way. But of course, it's a very modern release. I like Scout the most of the three, but I think Brian Boru probably should have won, in my opinion. That's how I voted anyway.
Oh my god! So that's the part where I have to complain about Brian Boru. Huh? That's the end debate. That's the big end debate.
Well, here's your chance.
Okay, so Brian Boru, I guess Andy just wrote this question to hear that, and if I don't answer the way he wants, he will keep formulating questions until he gets around from me. Last time he tried to bait around about high society, so Brian Boru is the game I enjoyed the most out of the three. It has, in my opinion, nothing to do with an OG award. Because imagine, right? The central gameplay of Brian Boru is you play a trick and then you control an area. Except each card is composed of between 3 and 6 icons and the suit and the value. That starts well. And then you win regions by controlling the most town in the region. You win some diversification bonus by controlling towns a bit everywhere on the map, presence in a variety of regions. But then, whenever you don't win a trick, you can use the secondary mode of the card, which is not controlling a region, but advancing on 3 different tracks that have secondary bonuses. So at the end of each round, whoever is ahead on one of the 3 secondary tracks gets a thing. Nice. They get to wreck someone else's town. They get to put a monastery somewhere. But guess what? The runner-up on each track, they will get a consolation prize because we're the modern Euro now. What's the consolation prize? Well, the winner, they spend all their advancement of the track, and I said that at the beginning. The runner-up, what do? They get 1 step back on the track so that other people have a chance to catch up, and they get 1 compensation victory points, except on the marriage track, where it depends on how far advanced you are on the thing. But also, whenever you play with the most advanced on the Vikings track, you gain a renown. And then you score points equal to the amount of total renown you had since the beginning of the game. And also, when you win marriage, some of the cards in marriage grant you some stuff and some other grants you VPs. And then you have Estrid, the Danish princess supermodel, who's the final prize for marriage on round 3 or 4, whatever. Either she grants VPs, or she has a secondary mode to grant VP in a different convoluted way. And then, at the end of the game, each player counts the renown they have, and they score pounds equal to the renown again. And then, guess what? The player with the most leftover coins gets an extra victory point, because the poor soul didn't get an opportunity to spend them. And then we're done. Except not, because guess what? If you won the last trick, you should be able to lead the next trick, but you can't lead the next trick because the game is over. What are we going to do to you? We're going to give you a victory point. This game is mad.
Appreciate the recap.
Yeah, I get the. I mean, I didn't play any of the games. So, Nicholas, from your description, it seems like somebody would try to design an OG game without ever playing anything but modern Euros.
It's actually from the designer of König von Siam.
Yeah, I know it is.
Yeah, Pierre Sylvester.
Yeah. Or as Martin said to me, Samo, you won't like it. So, and this is enough for me, he knows. I mean, the only game of this I'm eager to try is Scout, exactly, because I love climbing games. But I'm not sure if I'm that eager.
The Scout is great. I would definitely recommend it. I'm not sure, I can't deny anything you said, Nicholas. And keep in mind, I think you said that you liked that game the most of the 3. Is that right?
Oh, yeah.
Or were you being sarcastic?
I absolutely 100% like that. I like it marginally more than Scout and a lot more than Whale Riders.
Yeah. I guess the way I looked at Brian Boru, like if Brian Boru came out 20 years earlier, it would have a much sharper edge to it.
Yeah.
I guess I'm looking at Brian Boru as a product of its time. Like there's lots of modern Euros that if we don't like modern Euros, we would not want to have a look at. You know, if we like OGs because we're as a part of the OG guild, here's a new game that has some OG elements that you might want to look at.
Yeah.
And that's one goal some of us or a lot of us have with the guild too, is we want to promote newer games of this style. And so if somebody were to say Scout, you know, is the OG game of the year, it's like, well, is Scout really OG? It's kind of a shedding game, but it's kind of a unique shedding game. So is that a good example of OGs, right? And Whale Riders is a great example of an OG. It's just not that great. And at least Brian Boru, it's a great game that has some OG elements. So that's why it got my vote.
Yeah, I think that Scout is masquerading as a shedding card game. Scout is secretly a dominoes game, but the dominoes are cards. Look, if I get my one opportunity on pooping on Brian Boru, can I just ask, why is the game named Brian Boru? Can someone explain that to me? There is no Brian Boru amongst the components. There is no Brian Boru amongst the faction. Like, is the point...
You can't marry Brian Boru?
You can't... Is the player who wins the game retroactively named Brian Boru in order to fit some historical continuity? I don't know. The rulebook doesn't say anything about Brian Boru whatsoever. It's in the time of Brian Boru, and you're trying to become the High King of Ireland.
What if you designed a solo mode where you're playing against Brian Boru? Huh?
No.
Okay.
The way the question was formulated leaves me with the coy way of not having to pick any of the three games, because I think Andy just asked which game should have won. And in my opinion, none of the nominated should have won. From the limited amount of games I've played, and I do not play a lot of new games, the only reason why I've played the nominated ones is because they were nominated, my Ogie of the year would be a small little two-player area control game named Great Plains. It's very cute. You have this little slightly randomized hexagonal board on which you place little animals and you are just trying to get the most animals on there. And sometimes you step on a leaf, and what's under the leaf? Ooh, a little special power that is very simple. It's just push one of the opponent's guy away so that they get stuck on the wall, and then you can develop a bit more. And then, at the end of the game, you have 11 of your foxes on the board and the opponent has 10 of their crows. And by the power of maths, you've won.
By the power of maths.
I forgot, of course, that there were lots of other nominees, and those were just the final three. Looking back at my votes, I had voted for Brian Boru and Hekmek M. Kartanek, the Picomino card game, which is actually quite good. Probably that would have gotten my vote had that made it into the final three.
What's the difference with the dice game?
Too much to count, actually. I'm not sure I can get into it right now. It's actually got a little bit of a Taj Mahal kind of feel to it. So instead of on your turn you're rolling the dice multiple times, you're just laying down all the cards of a single value at once. Mm-hmm. And then when your turn comes back around again, you can add more cards of a different value. But it's when you back out, it depends on kind of what benefit you get. It's a little bit of for sale. I need to play it more, though. I haven't played it a ton. That probably would have gotten my vote.
And finally, long-time listener Bard AI wrote, I'm a big fan of your show and I always enjoy listening to you talk, but I have one question that's been nagging at me for a while. What's the deal with wooden cubes? Why can't OG games just use something else?
I like wooden cubes from a practical point of view. For one thing, they're easier to pick up and put down. You don't have to worry about what side they're on. But also they're easy to replace. So if your game is missing pieces, you can just easily add wooden cubes from a different game. Maybe they're not exactly the same size, but you can still play the game. There's nothing wrong with liking little wooden figurines, meeples, or that. I know the most recent version of El Grande used tiny meeples instead of cubes. Yeah, there's no reason you can't do that. I just find cubes just practical from a playability point of view. The only real downside is, for people who are colorblind. Right, at least meeples you can have different shapes, or you can have like an imprint on one side or something to make it look a little different. And you don't really have much room to do that with cubes.
Has the new version of El Grande also replaced the king so that it looks a bit more family friendly?
I think it's purple now.
Okay, so worse.
And the Castillo is cardboard, not wooden.
Well, I actually checked which games that I like actually have cubes. And so the highest rated is my Fantasy Flight Games copy of Condottiere. And the second one doesn't really have cubes, it has small houses, and this is Vignetta. This is a bit obscure game which looks like a boring Euro, but it's completely chaotic. And for me, the simplicity is always like, let the theme come through. Don't show everything, just highlight, let the theme come in the mind.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that there are players who would have a hard time. They want to be immersed in the setting or something, and cubes are a problem with that. But even if you had like plastic minis, they're plastic. They're not life-sized. Like at some point, you are using your imagination to take you the rest of the way.
Yeah, I mean, we're back on, is Tigris and Euphrates a thematic game or is it themeless and dry?
Which is it? Tune in next time.
Well, yeah, which could be an entire episode. If you'd like to send some fan mail, for the time being, it will still be via private message on BoardGameGeek at Nicholas Weiss on BoardGameGeek. How do you spell Nicholas Weiss? Because it's a bit tricky, because it's a French Nicholas without the H and a German Weiss, so I will spell it out for you. Nicolas space Weiss. Ba-ba-da-ba-ba-bum. If you are part of the guild or not part of the guild and want to be, or are in our Discord server right now or not in our Discord server right now and are going to join in just right now, there's a reminder that we have a sort of online convention, OG Spring Con, and con being between air quotes, maybe that Mark will rebrand the name as OG Spring Fest, which is an entire weekend of gaming that will happen on the third weekend of May, I think the 20th and 21st of May, in which various people will come and create events to play games with other guild members. If there's a game that you want to play, don't hesitate creating an event right now, because what Mark, the organizer, actually expects is that everyone will bloody procrastinate and only start booking stuff in the last week where everyone thinks the event is dead because nobody has booked anything to begin with. So please, post the podcast right now, go on Discord and book an event for us to join. Do you want to play Ra? Say, I want to play Ra. I want to play it Saturday at 6 p.m. my time. And Discord events, when you book them on your local time, will convert to everyone else. So you don't have to understand how daylight saving time works, how hemisphere works, how time zones works. It will all do it for you. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I have been Nicholas Weiss, and I have no idea how to finish this.
Keep that in.
Thanks everyone for joining in. This was the first proper official episode of Cube Roots, our OG Games podcast. Joining me today were Daryl Boone. Where can you find you? What do you do in life?
Well, I have a restaurant, 2 restaurants in beautiful Vancouver, Canada, called Pizzeria Ludica. I also have a small, humble YouTube channel, which is technically sponsored by the restaurant. A humble YouTube channel where I talk about older board game gems, and it is called Board Gems. And you can search for it on YouTube, or I think I actually own the domain boardgems.com, so you can try that.
And I want to thank you, Samo, for joining us today. Where can I find you? And I want to thank you. And I want to thank you, Samo, for joining us today. Where can people find you? Oh, that's a horrible sentence. Yeah, thank you, Daryl. I know.
If people want to stalk you, where should they go?
If people want to stalk you and send you internet hate mail, fucking hell.
Cat hijacked Nicholas. Cat now in charge.
How can people find you?
We've lost Nicholas, I'm afraid. He's too tired now. He's
I need a nap.
become delirious.
So right now my posting privileges on BGG have been revoked, but I still have BGG mail, so there's that. And I'm around on OG Discord. Otherwise, I do Slovenian things in Slovenia. Oh, there's just another thing I want to add somewhere, but I don't know where to fit. It's like additional reading. Yeah, I just want to mention like two articles that influenced a lot of my thinking on this whole modern Euros versus old Euros, and they're both like from Michael Barnes, of course. One is the already mentioned in episode 0, the game that ruined Euros. But the other one was, I think, a bit misunderstood, and this was Fun First, or Fun First design. So design which is immediate, accessible, and you don't need to go through layers and layers. And that's maybe for some other time.
Another person who had their posting privileges revoked on BGG. You're in good company.
And I've been Nicholas Weiss. I'm still useless. I'm sponsored by my cat. Thanks everyone for listening to the podcast. We'll see you next time. And now is the part where we say bye and we maintain a conversation going just long enough for the outro to fade in.
Nobody can, listen how I, am eager to play Terraforming Mars and stuff.
No, it's fine.
I heard this Ark Nova game is pretty good. I'm
not
curious about
You
it.
can make better jokes than that.
Ark, no way!
Oh my god.
Q-Brutes, what does the name even mean? Q-Brutes, no idea or smart in Q-Brutes, pressing the ICO.
I don't know to end this
Outro.